October, 1891. Northern Minnesota. The kind of country where the pines grow so thick the daylight feels rationed. And every sensible man knows one thing before the first snow ever falls. If your walls fail in January, nothing else about your life matters. That was why people stopped to stare when Mikko Hallinen began building his new house at the edge of a clearing above the Embarrass River. Because Mikko was not raising straight logs. He was not stacking planks. He was not notching corners the way every camp carpenter and homesteader in the district had been taught. He was building his walls out of short rounds of tamarack and cedar, each one cut to nearly the same length, each one laid with its circular face turned outward and packed into thick pale mortar. From a distance, it looked ridiculous. Like a woodpile had been stood on end. Like a child had tried to build a cabin out of stove lengths and mud. Gideon Rusk saw it first from horseback. Rusk was the timber boss for the largest cutting operation in that part of the country. He knew trees by bark, by smell, by sound. He could glance at a stacked landing and tell you how many board feet were sitting there. Men trusted him because he was almost never wrong about wood. He pulled his horse up along the trail above Mikko's clearing and just stared for a second. Then he called down, loud enough for the two teamsters behind him to hear. "What exactly are you building, Hallinen?" Mikko looked up from his trowel. Calm face. No hurry in him. "A house." One of the teamsters laughed. "No, it ain't. It's winter's kindling arranged optimistic." The other one leaned over the wagon rail. "Looks like he's mortaring in next year's firewood." Gideon dismounted and walked closer. He crouched, ran his glove across the cut faces of the wood, then rapped his knuckles against the fresh mortar. "You've turned the end grain out," he said. "You've got seams everywhere. Rain will get in. Frost will pry it apart. And if a spark ever catches that dry sidewood, the whole thing'll burn like a warning." He stood, looked square at Mikko, and said the word that mattered most in a country like that. "Foolish." Not crazy. Not eccentric. Foolish. Out there, foolish could kill children. Foolish meant your wife slept in a coat. Foolish meant the stove redlined all night, and the room still iced over before dawn. The men on the wagon laughed because that is what people do when someone else has just been marked as the fool in public. Mikko said nothing. He scraped up another load of mortar, set another round in place, nudged it level with 2 fingers, and kept building. The mockery followed him through the rest of the fall. Men slowed their teams just to look. Children called it the button wall house. One trader in Bilwabik asked Mikko if he planned to invite woodpeckers in as boarders. Mikko never argued. He never made speeches. He never said the line that would have sounded clever later. He just built. And that is the part the settlement misunderstood. Because this story was never about whether Mikko Hallinen could take being laughed at. It was about whether he understood winter better than the men who thought they already had it mastered. Mikko Hallinen had not come to Minnesota as a carpenter. Back in Finland, in a village north of Oulu, he had worked around smoke saunas, charcoal pits, and bake ovens. He had helped lay stone, shape flues, seal gaps, and nurse heat through long dark winters when firewood was labor and warmth was mathematics, whether a man knew the word mathematics or not. He and his wife, Alina, came to America with their little daughter Aino. Then their son, Juho, born after the crossing. Because land in the old country belonged to too few men, and winters there did not forgive poverty any better than winters here. Their first season in Minnesota had gone the way it went for most new settlers. They threw up a quick shelter with help from neighbors. Boards where they could get boards. Logs where they could get logs. Mud and moss and hurry in all the places where money should have gone. By daylight that first house looked respectable enough. By January, it felt like surrender with a stove in the middle. The cast iron heater glowed hot. The walls stayed mean. Frost feathered across the inside boards by dawn. The bucket near the door filmed over. Alina slept in wool stockings and woke with her jaw aching from clenching against the cold. Once, around 2 in the morning, Miko touched the wall beside their bed and felt it draining the heat straight out of the room, as if the forest itself had reached inside to take it back. That winter changed the way he looked at every cabin in the settlement. Men thought the problem was always the stove. Bigger stove, more wood, hotter burn. Miko watched the opposite truth reveal itself night after night. The fire was not the weakness. The walls were. He studied where frost formed first. He watched the chinking crack as timber dried. He held his hand near the seams and felt the tiny drafts moving. He noticed how a conventional wall gave warmth and easy road to travel. Long fibers, long logs, long seams, straight paths. And he began asking a question the log men were not asking. Not, how do you stack wood fast? Not, how do you span distance with fewer cuts? Not, how do you raise walls with the least labor before snow? How do you make heat work to leave? That difference in question changed everything. Miko did not need perfect saw logs. He needed the discard lengths the camps treated as low-value leftovers. Short tamarack, cedar, and crooked sections too awkward for mill stock. He bought them cheap. Then he cut them into near-matching rounds, each about 18 inches deep, and stacked them by the hundreds. Alina watched the pile grow with a kind of disciplined worry. "Looks like firewood," she told him one evening. "It is," Miko said, "just facing the right direction." That line was the whole method. In an ordinary cabin, the long grain of the log runs from the warm room straight toward the frozen air outside. Wood is full of tiny aligned fibers, and heat moves along those fibers more easily than it moves across them. Add cracked chinking and shrinking timbers, and a standard frontier wall becomes a stitched-together escape route for warmth. Miko turned the fibers sideways. By setting the cut ends outward, he forced heat to travel across grain instead of along it. A much slower journey through cell walls, trapped air, and broken pathways. But he did not stop there. His mortar was not simple mud. He mixed slaked lime, clay, sharp sand, sawdust, and rye chaff into a thick fibrous bedding that could lock the rounds in place without creating a hard, icy bridge through the wall. He laid 2 beads of mortar instead of 1, inner and outer, and left a cavity between them. That cavity he packed loosely with dry sawdust and moss. A soft thermal break running through the middle of the wall. Wood, mortar, air, then more resistance, then more air again. Not a wall built like a beam, a wall built like a trap. When Gideon Rust came back in late November to deliver an official refusal on a request for hauled cordwood, the structure was chest-high and unmistakably taking shape. Rusk did not hide his irritation. "My sled teams are not hauling stove billets for an experiment. I'll haul what I can myself," Miko said. Rusk stared at the wall and shook his head. "You are spending twice the labor to build something half as trustworthy." Miko checked the plumb line hanging from a roof brace, adjusted one round with his thumb, and answered without heat. "We will see." That was all. Theory had been laid in mortar. Now winter would test it. Winter came early and hard. By the second week of January, 1892, the sky had acquired that pale metallic look northern people learned to fear. Then the wind shifted. Then the temperature dropped as if somebody had opened a door in the north and forgotten to close it. For 14 nights in a row, it plunged below 30 below zero. Timbers cracked in the dark like gunshots. Horse breath froze white on harness leather. The iron pump handle at the community well could skin a hand if a glove slipped. Inside ordinary cabins, life narrowed to fuel and endurance. Ole Matson and his boys fed their stove in shifts, sleeping in coats between turns. At the Bell place, Frost climbed the interior wall behind the bed until it looked like white lace sewn directly onto the boards. A mother in the next clearing kept her youngest child wrapped against her chest because the boy's cough worsened whenever the fire dipped. Men chopped wood by lantern light, not because it was wise to work outdoors in that cold, but because the alternative was running out by dawn. The settlement was discovering, in the most physical terms possible, that a bad wall makes every winter longer than the calendar says it is. Then there was Mikko Hallinen's house. The chimney smoked, yes, but not with the frantic dark plume of a stove driven like an engine at the edge of failure. Its smoke rose thin and steady, a patient gray thread against the white woods. Inside, the air held. That was the miracle. Not heat like a furnace. Heat that stayed where it had been made. The small stove burned low and even. The thick walls soaked warmth and gave it back slowly. There were no icy corners where cold pooled like water. No feathering frost along the bedboards. No desperate midnight scramble to drag the children closer to the fire. The Lena kneaded rye dough at the table in shirt sleeves with the cuffs rolled once. Aino sat on the floor threading blue yarn through a card loom Mikko had cut for her from scrap pine. Shuho slept under one blanket instead of three. On the shelf near the lamp sat an inkwell. That inkwell did not freeze. For anyone who has lived through a northern frontier winter, the detail says almost everything. In most cabins within 20 miles, ink had to be kept near the stove, thawed in a palm, coaxed into use. In Mikko's house it sat on a shelf and remained simply ink. There was another proof too. At dawn, when the fire had burned down to a red memory instead of a live blaze, the room was still livable. The walls had taken the day's heat into themselves, and were releasing it back with the patience of stone. That is what high thermal mass does when it is married to insulation and a broken heat path. It turns a room from a battlefield into a reservoir. Outside, Gideon Rusk was having the worst winter of his professional life. At camp, axles were freezing. Men were burning through wood stocks meant to last much longer. The bunkhouse stove had to be fed nearly around the clock. Sleep came shallow because somebody always had to rise before the room collapsed back toward the temperature of the world outside. Gideon hated failure, especially the kind with numbers attached to it. Wood consumption up. Labor strain up. Horses weakening. Output threatened. Then a tally discrepancy on a cedar landing near the Hallinan clearing forced him out on inspection during the coldest stretch yet. He rode because he had to. By the time he finished checking the stacks, his cheeks were burning numb inside his scarf, and the joints in his fingers felt wooden even through good gloves. On the ride back he saw the Hallinan chimney again. Still that thin lazy ribbon of smoke. That detail bothered him more than if the chimney had been belching like a locomotive. A hard-driven house smoked hard. That was what made sense. This house did not. So he turned off the trail. Squealed under Gideon's boots as he crossed the yard. The north wall of Mikko's house faced the wind clean and direct. If the thing was failing, it would fail there first. He expected to see split mortar, rimed seams, dark wet staining around the rounds, the first signs of rot or heave. Instead he saw a wall that looked settled and composed. The cut faces of the wood wore a dusting of fine snow. The mortar joints were tight. The wide roof overhang had kept the worst of weather off the surface. Nothing looked panicked. Nothing looked like a structure in trouble. Gideon pulled off his right glove. He did it partly out of skepticism, and partly out of that professional instinct that makes a good foreman trust his own nerve endings more than another man's theory. He pressed his bare palm against the wall, and stopped. He had prepared himself for the savage bite frozen wood usually gives. That instant ache that feels like the material is stealing heat directly out of your hand. But the wall did not bite. It yielded a muted warmth. Not stove hot. Not warm like skin. Warm the way a brick bake oven can remain warm long after the fire is done. Stored warmth. Even warmth. He moved his hand from one wood round to the mortar beside it. Then lower. Then higher. The temperature was astonishingly consistent. Behind him, the air sat somewhere around 30 below. Under his palm, the wall felt alive with retained heat. That was the moment Gideon Rusk lost the argument. Not in public, not in language, in the body. He stood there another few seconds, palm against the wall of the house he had called foolish, while the wind worked at his back. Then he went to the door and knocked. Miko opened it. Warmth rolled out, not harsh and dry and desperate, but stable. Civilized. A house that was doing its job without drama. Gideon stepped inside and saw at once what no theory could have shown him half so powerfully. Elena was stirring something at the stove. The children were not huddled there. They were playing on the floor away from it. A loaf was rising under a cloth on the table. The lamp flame stood steady. There was no frost on the walls. No steaming breath in the room. No signs of siege. Gideon looked around slowly, letting the evidence finish its work. Finally he looked at Miko and said, very quietly, "You did not build a cabin." Miko waited. Gideon glanced back at the round-ended wall. "You built a cork for winter." That was as close to surrender as a man like him was likely to come. The next questions came fast. How thick were the walls exactly? What was the mortar mix? How much wood had it taken compared to a standard cabin? How long had the stove burn each night? How much fuel had they used so far this season? Miko answered everything. No smugness. No delayed revenge. No performance for the pleasure of the moment. He showed Gideon the wall section by the window opening. The twin mortar beds. The loose insulating fill in the center. The way the roof eaves protected the faces of the wood. The logic of letting any small moisture migration dry back outward through breathable joints, rather than sealing it inside. Gideon listened, the way competent men listen when the world has just forced them to update themselves. Then he went back to camp with a new problem. If this method worked in one house, what would it do in a tool shed? In a storehouse? In a bunkhouse where one stove and too many sleeping men had been fighting the cold like a losing war? One warm cabin was a curiosity. A repeatable fuel-saving building method could change operations. By February, Gideon Rusk had ordered a cordwood tool house built at the main camp. The men called it the boss's woodpile shack until the first real freeze after completion. Then they stopped joking. The structure held warmth from the men working inside so well that metal tools no longer took on the same killing cold overnight. Next came a larger test. A new bunkhouse, built with tamarack rounds, lime clay mortar, and an insulated cavity nearly identical to Miko's wall. That building changed the conversation for good. It burned far less wood than the older bunkhouses. The stove could be banked at night, instead of fed like a panic. Men slept longer without waking to a room that had gone hard and mean before dawn. Condensation dropped. Draft complaints disappeared. Fuel hauling eased. You could chart the difference in ledgers. You could feel it in your lungs. You could see it in the woodpile, lasting longer than anyone expected. And on a frontier, practical success spreads faster than pride can stop it. By the following summer, settlers began visiting the Hallinan place, not to laugh, but to measure. They copied wall thickness. They wrote down mortar recipes. They asked which woods worked best, how deep the eaves should project, how long the rounds should be cut, how dry the filler ought to be before packing. Miko told them. He did not patent the idea. He did not hoard it. He did not behave like a man guarding a miracle, because that was never what he thought he had built. What he had built, in his mind, was simply a wall that respected the direction heat wanted to travel, and made that journey difficult. That is the part that makes this story more than a neat frontier anecdote. Long before building science had clean diagrams for thermal bridges, before architects spoke fluently about continuous insulation, thermal mass, or broken conductive pathways,
One quiet immigrant in the North Woods arrived at the same logic with observation, necessity, and memory. He did not use modern jargon. He used winter. He saw that a wall can fail, not because it is weak in the carpenter's sense, but because it is generous in the wrong direction. He understood that a good shelter is not just something that stands up. It is something that refuses to surrender what matters once you have made it.
And reached beyond one Minnesota clearing. The timbermen knew how to make a structure strong. Mikko Hallinen knew how to make one reluctant to give up warmth. Those are not the same question, and they do not produce the same answer. There is a reason this story still lands. Because nearly every field has its Gideon Rusks, competent people, respected people, people with real knowledge, who mistake familiarity for completeness. And nearly every breakthrough looks foolish from the angle of the old habit it disrupts. A wall of upright firewood, a ridiculous house, a laughable idea, until the cold arrived. Then winter, which has no interest in pride, and no patience for bad assumptions, rendered its verdict. The cabins built the ordinary way needed constant rescue from the stove. Mikko's house held. The mockery ended not because somebody won an argument, but because the evidence became warm enough to touch. And maybe that is the cleanest lesson of all. Most men in the North Woods knew how to stack wood. Mikko Hallinen asked a better question. How do you keep heat from leaving? The frontier was changed by that question. One round of cedar at a time.